Let's review some of the historical events that were happening for the Rolling Stones in the second half of 1965, starting in the summer and going forward. Well, their album Out of Our Heads was released in July in the US, going to #1 in the country. Of course, at that time, Satisfaction was on the charts as a single, as we've talked about as well. Had been released in May, so strictly speaking in the first half. But so here comes the album, Out of Our Heads, #1 on the American charts. That album is released in its British version in September, goes to #2 in the UK charts. In August, Alan Klein is appointed co-manager by Andrew Loog Oldham of the Rolling Stones. Talk a little bit more about Alan Klein in just a minute, but the Alan Klein engagement, or his sort of entering into the Rolling Stones circle, really starts in August of 1965. Get Off of My Cloud is released in September and goes to #1 in the US. I Can't Get No Satisfaction had gone to #1. Now Get Off of My Cloud has gone to #1. The Rolling Stones now have 2 #1 hits in a row. We already talked about As Time Goes By and Last Time together over the course of 1965. 4 singles, all in the top 10. 2 of them at #1 in 1965. You can see why it's the year of satisfaction. Get Off of My Cloud is released in October in the UK, goes to #1. In the fall, they tour UK and Europe during September and October of 1965. They do their 4th US tour in November of 65. December's Children is released in the US only, goes to #4 in December, just in time for Christmas shopping. In fact, it's interesting if you look down, you look down a lot of bands' album release things, but you look down the Rolling Stones release dates, and there are very few Christmas seasons when they did not bring out some kind of a record that could be bought as a gift, and that's a great time to kind of get product on the market if you want to think of it from a marketing point of view. December's Children had had very little new music on it, just things that had been released in other forms sort of compiled together. So I'm counting it as a studio album because a lot of the stuff on the US end hadn't been released in this country yet, and there is actually some new stuff on it, so we'll count that as an extra studio album and talk about it in just a minute. And then by the end of the year, As Tears Go By was released as a single, as I said before, going to #6. So a pretty good second half of the year for the Rolling Stones. Let's turn our attention now to Alan Klein and why he's an important figure. We've devoted an entire video lecture to Andrew Loog Oldham and his importance as a manager of the group. Alan Klein is maybe a guy who comes in kind of second when it comes to thinking about at least the business, the Rolling Stones' business interests and the money and their finances, because he starts to figure in increasingly from this period in August of 1965. Alan Klein, an American from the East Coast, New York, New Jersey background, I think born in 1931, so a guy a bit older by more than a decade than Andrew Loog Oldham. And he had a background, started out working in the music business as a kind of a bookkeeper, but he got a real ability to understand the ins and outs of record company contracts. In fact, one of the things, a very smart man and a very good with numbers, he was able to figure out how the record companies were withholding money from artists through the complexity of the contract. So if you understood how the contract was working, you could figure out how the record companies were actually depriving artists of money they had rightfully earned, but doing it all through the terms in the contract. Of course, most artists didn't have attorneys who could look into the contract and make the record companies pay out on these amounts. And so most artists basically just went without the money and the record companies pocketed it. But Alan Klein figured out how that was done. And the famous story about Alan Klein, in fact it's told in Andrew Loog Oldham's recent book Stone Free, is the story of Bobby Darin. Back in the early 1960s, Bobby Darin was a teen idol. He was signed with a record company, and Alan Klein somehow met up with Bobby Darin, and he said to Bobby Darin, "How'd you like to make $100,000? And Bobby Darin said, "Well, sure. What have I got to do?" Alan Klein said, Nothing. Leave it to me. So he goes into Bobby Darin's recording contract, and sure as heck, he finds at least $100,000 worth of royalties that Bobby Darin was owed in that contract that he would not otherwise have gotten had it not been for Alan Klein's looking into it and representing him. So what ended up happening is that Alan Klein took his piece of that, and Bobby Darin got his piece of it, and Alan Klein began to develop this reputation as being the guy who could go in on behalf of an artist and get them their money. These were the terms under which Andrew Loog Oldham met Alan Klein, who at the time, as I say, was 11, 12 years older than Andrew. So he was the older guy, more experienced guy in the music business. Andrew Loog Oldham said there was never any question who was the senior and who was the junior in our relationship. It was always Alan. He was always the senior guy. So he went on to handle the Stones' finances through some protests of Eric Easton. He thought he was the partner. But Andrew Loog Oldham, Andrew Loog Oldham didn't so much want to be the guy who took care of the money and that kind of thing. He wanted to be the guy who shaped the talent. Remember all that stuff about him wanting to be an impresario and admiring Larry Parnes and Johnny Jackson, the character from Espresso Bongo, and this kind of thing. So this is really what he wanted to do. So it was great to have a guy like Alan Klein who could take care of the dollars and cents a part of things. If you read Bill Wyman's autobiography, Bill Wyman complains a lot about not having been able to see any of the money they were making, trying to get money from Alan Klein, having it not show up. Where is this money? We thought, there were Alan Klein was not only good at finding out how other people had hidden money in contracts, he also seemed to have been pretty handy at well, I would say hiding the money, but there you go. The guy the Rolling Stones were asking for money, and it wasn't coming. And so, what exactly is going on there? It's unclear. One thing's for sure: artists always complain about not getting their money from management, from record labels. So it would be unfair to say anything untoward about Alan Klein, except that people complained they weren't getting their money. Well, anyway, they got bad enough that at a certain point in the early 1970s, the Stones decided to just get out of that relationship entirely. But there's no doubt about it that Alan Klein did an awful lot to advance the careers of the Rolling Stones with his management. He also got involved in the Beatles at the end after Brian Epstein passed away, after Apple Records was kind of going downhill. Alan Klein came in. And so he enters the story here for the Rolling Stones, and we'll have cause to return to discussing Alan Klein as we go forward, especially as we get into a period in the late 60s and the early 1970s, the tax exile years, things like that. One other thing I wanted to focus on here for just a minute is what I call the tour madness around the Rolling Stones. Once the Rolling Stones started to get really big in the UK and in Europe and then in the US, their shows were frequently the occasion for some kind of a riot. It was so frequent when they were touring UK and Europe that the band would make bets with each other, at least this is according to Keith Richards. They would make bets with each other about how far into their set they'd be able to get before the police would make them stop. So the whole idea was they'd never get the whole, and they're only playing like 30-minute sets, they'd never get the whole 30 minutes out. So I'd be like, I think we'll get to the third song. No, I'm saying in the second song it's going to go down, whatever. And they would make these bets, and whoever would lose would have to pay up at the end of it, and there was kind of a little game that they played. Well, what does that mean? It meant that it was so typical that they wouldn't be able to play through their set because the police would shut them down, that the Rolling Stones concerts became synonymous with teen riot. Wherever they went, there was some kind of a teen riot. Well, there's a great clip in one of the Rolling Stones documentaries. I think it's Crossfire Hurricane, the most recent one, where Mick Jagger is on television at the time with a couple of intellectuals, social historians or cultural historians or whatever. And the one expert is talking about how when you go to a Rolling Stones concert in the UK, that the girls are so excited about the Rolling Stones that they literally sort of pee themselves standing in place. If you read the Bill Wyman account of those Stones concerts, he said it was like there were like these little rivers going down the aisles until you realized that the rivers were urine, and these girls were all just, well, it sounds like a pretty wild situation. And so that's mentioned in this interview. But then that's kind of interesting, but what's really interesting is then Mick Jagger, all of like what, about 22, 23 years old at the time, says, well, that's the way it is when we perform in this country. But frequently when we perform in other countries, it's not armies of teenage girls who are there at the shows, it's armies of guys. And these young guys seem to be looking for some way of striking out at the police. And there are riots at these shows, and it isn't that they're rioting at us. They like us, but they're really not principally there, I think, for the music. I think what they're there for is an opportunity to strike out against authority. I'm sure they like our music very much, but we're just the catalyst. What they really want to do is, as Keith Richards said, have a go at the police. And so it turns out that there's this kind of cultural thing happening around the Stones and rebellion. Very much plays into the image that Andrew has been crafting for the group. And that the Stones are smart enough and detached enough as young men to be able to see what's happening around them, to be able to kind of analyze it a bit and try to understand it from a more sophisticated and intellectual point of view. So this whole idea of the Stones and aggression and rioting and rebellion, we'll come back to talk about the Stones at Altamont in 1969 and the terrible tragedy of somebody being killed right in front of the stage while they were performing at Altamont. And as terrible as that is, when you think about the stories of what was happening at some of those concerts in 64 and 65, you got to wonder why it took until 1969 for something really tragic to happen. I mean, it could have happened at any time in one of these riots. And so all of that sort of plays into the idea of the Stones as being troublemakers, as ne'er-do-wells, of leading kids down the wrong path as citizens and young individuals and this kind of thing. And it all plays into the Stones as being the ones, bad boys, as opposed to the Beatles being good boys. What Keith Richards likes to say is that, the Beatles were wearing the white hats. The good guys wore the white hats. The Beatles were wearing the white hats, so they weren't available to us. So when the other guys got the white hats, the only thing left are the black hats. So we wore the black hats and we were happy to do it. But then later, when he's talking about the drug bust that happened in 1967 and the way they were brought up on charges and actually sentenced to prison sentences that they barely served, but nevertheless, they were sentenced. He said, well, before that happened, the hats might have been black, but they were more kind of gray. After we had this run-in with the courts, and after we got these sentences and they sent us to jail, even for a short period of time, those hats were then black. Then we became outlaws. They made us outlaws. So all of this is starting to unfold here, right in front of people's eyes at these concerts as they go along. And so this is a Rolling Stones tour, craziness and madness. Well, let's turn to the next album in the next video. We've been talking about people who are out of their head, so let's talk about the album Out of Our Heads.